There is an agency most people in Washington, D.C. haven't heard of called the Surface Transportation Board. They are the remnants of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the much feared ICC of the 20th century. And they have postured themselves as undoing the very successful deregulation of freight rail in 1980. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with this story, I think that the deregulation of the transportation sector is one of the great American economic policy reforms in our history to save the industry from extinction. And now you've seen the rebirth of the freight rail industry in the US, and it's now the envy of the world. But the rebound of the freight rail industry in the US has been so successful that now political actors and their sort of self-interested allies seeking to undo some of that success.
Welcome to the Academy on Capitalism's video series. I'd like to thank you all for signing in. I'm Bill Klein, Executive Director of the Academy on Capitalism, and today we are talking with Marc Scribner. He's Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at the Reason Foundation. Hello, Marc. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, excellent. Yes, and I'm glad that we could get in touch here, and the web is 30 years ago I had to travel to DC to do this, and I get to talk to you just like this now. It was in the back of comic books. So my hair is gray, yours isn't. So this is a fabulous opportunity that I enjoy, and I want to come back to that technology point in a minute. But what I really want to start with is, Marc, what got you started when being interested in free markets, possibly libertarian issues? What initially got you interested in that?
Well, so I now work at the Reason Foundation, which is has a think tank arm, a research division, which I work in, and then it also most famously has Reason Magazine. And I first picked up a copy of Reason Magazine when I was a freshman in high school at the bookstore with such things still existed in the magazine rack there. And I'd been interested in politics, wasn't really drawn to either of the two major parties, and certainly interested in a kind of individualistic outlook. So after reading Reason, I then read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and I've been interested in libertarian thought, gone down many rabbit holes on the history of libertarianism since. And I've been fortunate enough to work for libertarian organizations, free market organizations, since I began my career, or almost since I began my career.
As you read that in high school, and as you went on to be an undergraduate, I see that you majored in both economics and philosophy. Can I ask why those two choices?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was an econ major and a declared econ major, and but I had been taking so many philosophy electives that by the time I was approaching graduation, I realized I only needed to take another couple of courses, and I would also have the double major. So that's how it ended up. And I wasn't as interested. I didn't take political philosophy in college. I read political philosophy outside of my coursework. I was really more interested in some of the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science topics, not as much to do with with libertarianism per se, but certainly it gets you thinking in the kind of a rational mindset. How do we proceed with the big questions on the scientific method? Is there a scientific method? Those kinds of questions. interested me as well. So that's kind of how I ended up and double majoring in economics and philosophy. But I was by the time I was in college, I was already a committed libertarian. And I guess from my personal ideology, not all that much has changed since then.
No, and I think it's a great point and one to be emphasized that like anybody else in the world, just because somebody is a libertarian or conservative or liberal, it doesn't mean everything they have to take or read is centered around that. But nonetheless, they find value in certain things. My PhD is in philosophy, so I admit a certain bias. When I see somebody's taken it, I'm like, well, now, why did you, how did you find that useful? And it sounds like the philosophy of science material or way of thinking and being sort of critically investigating may have been something that's kind of served you since then.
Yeah, and it's kind of come full circle because I read a lot of Daniel Dennett back then, and he was doing all of these kind of crazy thought experiments that are now very relevant to the AI discussions that are happening today. So, and I do sort of part of my a major part of my transportation policy work is on automation. So not some of these more further out there on artificial general intelligence kind of questions, but it is interesting how how things, there may not be any kind of intention when you're doing it, but it does come in handy. I think reading Dan Dennett did come in handy. It turns out.
No, that's a great point, and uh, maybe at another time we could talk more about AI, or might even come up here. Uh, Let me ask you this question: You're because it ties into transportation. That's your specialty is transportation. Um, on the upside, on the good side of things, say in the last 20 years or shorter, what do you think has been the greatest innovation in transportation? And when I say greatest, I'm going to leave that up to your criteria so you can tell us what that means. But what's been something that we should all recognize as like, wow, this is really great that's happened in the last 20?
Well, I think from a global perspective, I think the proliferation of um, privatization as a strategy for procuring infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, has proven very successful. Mostly outside the U.S. So if you go to Europe or Asia or Latin America, you will see quite a bit of their public-private partnerships. So they're essentially long-term leases between the state and a private company that is then brought in to build, finance, operate, and maintain that infrastructure over a long period of time, generally 30 to 50 years. So it's functional ownership. It's not quite, there aren't as many pure divestitures in this arena in highways and airports. There are some, but it's mostly the public-private partnership model. But I think that came out of uh, a lot of work that libertarians had done. Bob Poole, the founder of the Reason Foundation, is sort of the godfather of this kind of privatization movement. And that has, I think, been mainstreamed in the infrastructure policy debates around the world. And it's something that, unless you're following this closely, you almost certainly don't realize that. I mean, you usually don't know who owns the road you're driving on or the airport you're passing through. But I think that's one really good example that's kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. And then I would say it's still emerging, but I do work on this issue a lot. And then I mentioned it, automation of particularly road vehicles, so self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles. We don't have they're not widespread. They haven't been deployed to scale, but you can go, there are a few places in the US in in San Francisco and in now Los Angeles, recently approved, and Phoenix, where you can get in a robo-taxi, and it's not the full metropolitan area, but it will take you, it'll pick you up and drop you off, no human driver. And I think the concept has been proven. We've already have commercial deployments in that, and I think that is going to be a automation across all modes of transportation. I think going in the 21st century is going to be one of the major stories, and I think it has sort of some profound implications on how we get around and how we organize the economy.
Wow. No, it also automated trucking seems to be
You go to
another.
Texas, you can see they're testing those on the roads today, and they hope this year, 2024, to see the first driverless commercial trucking deployments in Texas.
Um, I want to ask more questions about this. I just briefly want to go back to what you said about the privatization. There's two questions. Um, so with sort of public infrastructure, people who've maybe paid attention in the last several years might know that the ports, like the Port of Los Angeles or whatnot, there's public-private partnerships because there's external, private, um, perhaps private. Sometimes it looks like it might be other governments, who knows? But outside agencies that can manage and contract
Right.
to run those. And can you, what might be a place that we look to for such a successful private-public partnership in Europe of all places?
What
Is there an airport or something we could look at and say, oh, look, okay, I get that.
So a large share of the commercial service airports in Europe are now under private management, if not ownership. And so I think that, and there are now large companies that specialize in this, and infrastructure development funds that focus on these kinds of projects. That are doing work around the world. We do see some, the port example in the US. So we see terminal projects within ports, and we also see terminal projects within US airports that are undertaken by private companies and managed, financed by private companies. So you see a little bit of it in the US on those kind of smaller scale, not necessarily whole facility wide. Um, but yeah, in Europe, they've done this in most Western European countries have robust private infrastructure that in the U.S. is generally controlled by either an airport authority or a city. Um, and but you've got a number of highways, and these are generally toll roads because creating that revenue stream, that user revenue stream, is often very important for the success of these projects. And I think a lot of it, we do have these kinds of projects in the United States, um, uh, most often express toll lane or high occupancy toll lane projects.
Mhm.
So, they're toll lanes immediately adjacent to untolled interstates. We see that's where we see most of the action in the US. But if you go outside the US, you will see toll road networks that are functionally privately owned and operated. But like I said, it's not quite. Generally, these aren't divestitures. So the infrastructure after the end of this, say, 50-year concession, this long-term lease, um, once that contract is up, it defaults back to the state owner for them to either sign a new contract, or we're now starting to get to the end of some of these early contracts. So over the next decade, it'll be interesting to watch. But divestiture is always an option there. Take this entirely off the state's balance sheet is an option, and I think that that's something that hopefully some of these places will pursue.
And let me ask, because it might not be immediately apparent, when an airport or a municipality um, subcontracts like this for management, privatizes the managing of a facility, what are the benefits we see in that kind of arrangement? Because it looks like the material, I mean, the suitcases and the conveyor belts and all that's kind of the same. All that's changed is we've gone from a sort of, if you will, a public or a government kind of ownership to this private ownership. What difference does that make?
So I think the management just becomes more efficient because generally these contracts are structured on a performance basis. So these companies stand to lose money if they are not performing to according to their key performance indicators that are established in the contract. So you create those incentives that are lacking in public ownership and management, which under traditional public facilities ownership and management, often it's dictated by non-expert politicians who have their own provincial interests, and also there's a strong risk of capture by public employee unions who also have their interest is extracting as much as possible in terms of wages and fringe benefits. So when you have a private company come in that has a strong incentive to be efficient, to control costs, you end up delivering the kinds of improvements that customers see much more rapidly and much more consistently. So in the case of an airport, they are going to update that equipment much sooner than under a traditional public model, in part because they also have external financing available to them. They're not begging appropriators, politicians for money for a particular project. And they're also, I think in the case of toll roads, it's a good example. Since these companies are dependent on toll revenue, they have a strong incentive to, if there's an accident, which is inevitable, and it causes a breakdown in the traffic flow, they are losing money. So they have a strong incentive to clear those accidents as quickly as possible and keep traffic flowing. So all of these kinds of things, the kind of the benefits of markets we see in all other domains, they apply in public purpose, what we regard as public purpose infrastructure as well. And I think it's great that we've seen over the last 2 decades this really take off around the world. It's unfortunate that the United States, known globally as this beacon of capitalism, is really behind the times when it comes to peer countries in leveraging these kinds of procurement methods.
Yeah, no, and the reason I ask this is say, for instance, somebody's going to say Frankfurt Airport, and maybe they're kind of a typical American, and they might have the thought of, there's something really nice about this. This is a really great experience. Wow, Germany has this down, and not even realize that there's this private management aspect that's making their experience better. So, as a
Right.
passenger, and I don't know if
And Frankfurt, in fact, is one of the airports, and they're the company there. It's called Fraport, and they are a global airport company. And they're in addition to Frankfurt, they have another the kind of crown jewel in there. I think is in Lima. So these companies are operating globally. Primarily outside the United States. Fraport has had some, interactions with the U.S., but these are mainly taking place outside the U.S. But yeah, Frankfurt is a great example.
and uh when it's one of those things, is you're a customer, you're not, most customers aren't normally thinking of this. Am I experience reduced sort of wait times? Am I reducing fewer delayed flights? Is there more options in terms of amenities within the airport? So just kind of a few specific things that'll kind of maybe stick if somebody's watching this in their mind and they encounter, they're like, oh, okay, I get that.
Right. The comfort of airports, the amenities available are generally better. And that's why if you look at these global customer rankings of airports, the top 25 are dominated by uh, private companies. So that means, yeah, they're efficiently allocating space. They are upgrading facilities. You don't have crumbling, outdated passenger terminal waiting areas. And yeah, they manage their contracts within these are concessionaires of the whole airport, but they're still managing the concessions of their retail and all of that much better. Another thing they've done, and this is separate from airports, but is commercializing air traffic control. And that's something the United States has not done. But it's general in most countries, it's still a state-run enterprise, but there are in Canada, for instance, it is controlled by a nonprofit user co-op independent of the government. The United Kingdom's is a for-profit private company called NATS. So there are, and one thing we've seen on the air traffic control side is just like airports and just like these other modes of transportation, once they can issue revenue bonds and charge, user fees, they are going to much more rapidly modernize their technology. And they're also, under political management, you tend to build up a lot of the sort of middle management of these companies that are, not very productive and kind of serve as a way to employ people rather than serve customers. So you see a lot of efficiencies in the workforce there too. And I think the drive for if not profitability, cost efficiency is something that you really can't get under a traditional government monopoly model.
Yeah, return on cost of capital alone is a powerful motivator before you
Right.
even get to profit. No, once again, I think in the common mindset, people can associate, especially European countries, with a more government owned, I don't quite want to say socialism, it's such an overused word, but oh, the government there. But what you're indicating to me is that um, there's another story happening in Western Europe as well. And that story is that these governments are seriously engaging ways to utilize private enterprise, frankly, if not in the ownership, at least in the management of these facilities. And that is something I didn't know until I talked to you today. So I'm hoping that's something our readers find, or our listeners find interesting, and Google the top 25 airports and see for yourself, folks. Is that's something that's yeah, I wouldn't have expected it. And I chose Frankfurt because that was my exact reaction a long time ago when I landed in Frankfurt. And now I'm thinking like, oh, maybe that young man kind of surmised this situation all wrong. So I like learning new stuff. Let me ask you a question because you're talking about transportation. I'm going to come back to the United States if you don't mind. Not to say that's not generalizable, but right now, going on in the United States, whether it's on a state level, because we have some really big states like California and Texas, or a national level, what's the most harmful regulation you see either in effect or coming down the pipeline?
Oh, that's a tough one because there's there's a lot of troubling things happening in the U.S. Um, well, so
You can make it a couple.
one thing that really, yeah, one thing that concerns me in particular is with freight rail, which freight rail in the United States, unlike Western Europe and Asia and much of the world, has, aside from a very brief period during World War I, always been private. It is vertically integrated. Not only are these rail carriers, they're operating the trains, but they are infrastructure owner operators. They own that, and they own the land under the track and pay property taxes. That's sort of unheard of. They're private business. Their is there is a agency, even most people here in Washington, D.C., where I am, haven't heard of, called the Surface Transportation Board. And they are the remnants of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the much feared ICC of the 20th century. And they have pursued some pretty aggressive. None of this has really been finalized yet, but they've postured themselves as undoing, or at least partially undoing, the very successful deregulation of freight rail in 1980 under what was called the Staggers Rail Act. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with this story, I think that the deregulation of the transportation sector in the late 70s and early 80s is one of the great American economic policy reforms in our history. And the case of the railroads, of freight rail deregulation, I think is even stronger, even a better story than with airlines or trucking, which were also deregulated around that time, because with trucking and airlines, the purpose of deregulation was to break up these government created cartels or government enforced cartels. Um, with freight rail, it was to save the industry from extinction. The regulatory accumulation, railroads were the first, national industrial a group to be regulated by the feds beginning in the late 19th century, and over the subsequent decades, a lot of harmful regulations had accumulated, and then you saw air travel and cars and trucks take away a lot of their market share. So by the 1970s, they were kind of circling the drain. And the purpose of the Staggers Act, if you read the sort of the preamble, the Congress's justification for this was to prevent the total collapse of the industry, and that was feared at the time. There were talks of doing what Europe and Asia had done in a lot of cases, which was nationalizing the rail lines. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and now you've seen the rebirth of the freight rail industry in the U.S., and it's now the envy of the world. But we do now have, I think it's been the rebound of the freight rail industry in the U.S. has been so successful that now you see political actors and their sort of self-interested allies seeking to undo some of that success. And I think, the lesson of railroad regulation and deregulation in the US is that you may not notice these rules when they get imposed, the impact immediately, but this accumulates over time. So, an action you take today may end up having a very harmful effect 3 decades from now. And I worry that we're going to be having to relearn the lessons of rail deregulation rather than kind of build upon this success.
And let me ask, what is the real or supposed problems they're so concerned about that they want to regulate about?
There are, and a lot of this is coming from customers who, certain industrial bulk commodity customers, say within the agriculture and petrochemical industries, who by and large oppose deregulation when it happened and have been seeking either direct price controls, backdoor price controls, or otherwise, kind of service mandates. More control. They want to pay less and capture as much of that surplus for themselves as possible. And I think that it's short-sighted because these are generally the major bulk commodity shippers. Ignore that railroads have increasingly, since deregulation, been competing with trucks on what's known as intermodal, the shipping containers that we now move goods around the world in. And that has been the only way for rail to compete there is to raise enough revenue to reinvest into their system to ensure that rail remains fluid, so that the inherent time disadvantage that you're going to have with rail versus truck, that cost advantage is maintained. And the truth is that average freight rail rates are down by nearly half since deregulation. But I think that a lot of these customers have, and it's not all customers, but it's these persistent customers who now have the ear of the majority of the Surface Transportation Board. They are really pushing for some hard service mandates, things that will require the railroads to allocate service to them as opposed to other customers that it may make, in a free market setting, it may make more sense to allocate service to those others. So I think it's the same kind of meddling that brought about the initial problems under railroad regulation in the mid 20th century. And I think it's the hubris of regulators to say that they know better than markets. And it's concerning seeing this play out again as someone who's read, probably far too many books on the history of rail regulation and deregulation. It's a bit of a deja vu, and it's troubling.
So let me understand this correctly, so that we all can get a clear picture. One, rail rates since deregulation have decreased approximately 50%, might be a little less than that or whatever, but they've decreased substantially. One. Two, these customers who actually themselves are either firms or corporations, it's not somebody standing by the side of the tracks with a suitcase and a knapsack over their back, right? These are other profit-seeking companies in a supposed free market economy. They're shipping by rail because it's cheaper than trucking to do this. Am I correct on that?
Correct.
Okay.
Or water or barge, if that's available.
Or water or barge. So prices have come down. This is the cheapest option that you're using, and yet that's still not enough for them. They want to force these companies, the railroads, to prioritize them in some way over other businesses who don't have quite the political pool.
That's right. And I think, one major thing that the deregulation under the Staggers Act did was it legalized contract rates, so service contracts. Before that, railroads were required to adhere to common carrier tariff rates. So they were essentially regulated much like electric utilities are today. So you had to publish your rates in advance, and that's the rate that everyone faced. With a major purpose of Staggers was to legalize contract rates, so to allow shippers, so the customers and the railroad carriers, to negotiate customizable service contracts. And that gets into scheduling and volume and all of the kinds of things that when you publish just a straight tariff rate, you can't do that kind of customer. So for instance, before you could do service private contract rates, people generally didn't ship produce by train because it would rot in the boxcars, because you couldn't prioritize certain traffic, certain customers, and you couldn't come up with these creative arrangements. And certainly there wasn't the kind of investment in the system needed to keep produce from rotting. So that was actually the first thing, even before Staggers, deregulating produce transportation. So I think that's really what we're up against now, is a one size fits all government policy, which is what they tried for much of the 20th century, and it failed, versus the customizable market contracts that have proven so successful, and most traffic today on U.S. rail lines moves under contract rates because customers prefer that. The tariff rates still exist, but customers, like the carriers, prefer the customization that the private contracting enables.
I want to go very deep into the weeds for just 1 second here because I'm going to ask you a question and then I'm going to pull back. I have some other ones I want to ask you. But you mentioned being a common carrier, and the way that that manifested itself at the time back under regulation was the posting of common tariffs. What the deregulation allowed was now making individualized contracts that could prioritize certain rail cars, even customers, whatever. That's all in the contract. Once again, agriculture benefited by that. Also, one of the people now wanting more regulations, or not people, companies, customers. So you have all that going on. But even with that, they're still a common carrier. They can't refuse service to somebody who has the money and say is on the line, correct? So it's not like a total abandonment of the common carrier common law.
Correct.
There are still those, let us say, tort protections in place for customers or for people who want to do business with the railroads. That hasn't evaporated, has it?
No, and in fact, economic regulation of the railroads hasn't entirely evaporated either. I mean, that's what the Surface Transportation Board is charged with. So there are remaining economic regulatory authorities still in force today. You mentioned that you can't refuse. I mean, and that's the fundamental principle of a common carrier is non-discrimination. And there are special common carrier rules that apply to hazardous materials. So your listeners have probably heard of the East Palestine derailment in Ohio that happened last year, and it received a surprising amount of attention, surprising for me anyway, because there were no fatalities or injuries in that accident. But in the response to that, some politicians have proposed a variety of and this is on the safety regulatory side, which never disappeared. In fact, it's gotten more stringent since economic deregulation. But they proposed a bunch of counterproductive proposals. But one policy they have not looked at is the common carrier requirement that railroads ship hazardous materials in the first place. And railroads under law, have to prioritize hazardous materials. And the rationale for that, there's a 48-hour rule. You basically have to get this stuff moving quickly on the lines. The idea is to minimize exposure. So it's not sitting out in switching yards and things like that. It is going from origin to destination as quickly as possible, where it's when it's not moving on the if a toxic chemical is not moving at either the place it's being produced or used, that's where it is safest. So that's the rationale there. But none of the discussion that's followed this accident from last year has zeroed in on the requirement that railroads are required to carry this and to prioritize these hazardous materials. Also, the discussion hasn't really zeroed in on the fact that rail, despite an accident like that, is still an order of magnitude more safe than trucks, which also carry a lot of hazardous materials. You've probably driven on highways behind tank cars filled with some pretty nasty stuff. And
I
those
passed them very quickly.
yeah, you'll see those placards. You don't want to be near them when they get in a wreck, because that does happen, and people are injured and killed in those kinds of accidents. So I think the discussion really hasn't on the risk of this hasn't been very very intelligent. But also the fact that the government policy mandates these movements, that a lot of these other government bodies are criticizing, is interesting, and it just sort of shows how the right hand of government may have no idea what the left hand is doing.
Yeah, and there's more than just the right and left hand going on too. No, no, that's interesting, and also too, if we talk about perhaps perverse incentives, the fastest way to get, let us say, hazardous chemicals out of the transit phase might not overall be the best one. The shortest point from A to B might be through populated areas. The shortest point, or making A to B shorter, might mean going a little faster to meet the regulation, by the way. And maybe we don't want our hazardous material quite traveling at that speed. I mean, I'm not sure, but it does sound like it's an area that's ripe for sort of perverse incentives that actually might create the circumstances for accidents to happen or even to amplify how they happen rather than allowing uh, the managers to plan that out so that these travel as safely as possible because they don't want to wreck. I mean, because they'll get sued. They're a private company. They're not immune.
Yeah, absolutely. And railroads, I mean, they do have a strong incentive to not crash. I mean, aside from the liability of those particular accidents, I mean, railroads are it's a one-dimensional transportation system. You can go forward and backward. So if there is a derailment or blocking the line, no one's passing that, and that is money they are losing from other customers. So they have a very, very strong incentive beyond just avoiding liability from accidents to avoid accidents. And that's one thing we've seen. Economists have studied this since partial economic deregulation in 1980. You've seen a dramatic decline in rail accidents. Rail employee injuries are down well over 75% since then. And economists have looked at this and they don't attribute it to safety regulation. They attribute it to partial economic deregulation, which finally allowed railroads to earn an adequate return on capital and reinvest that into the system. Now, private railroads today invest about $25 billion a year back into their networks. It was essentially zero pre-stagger. So you had all this depreciating infrastructure, very little maintenance being done. They actually used to track in the 70s a phenomenon called standing derailments, where stationary rail cars sitting on track would the roadbed beneath the rail would crumble away and they would tip over or or go off the track. We don't have standing derailments like that anymore, at least not to the extent where people are tracking official statistics on them.
And I just wanted to point out something too. You mentioned earlier that the deregulations came in the late 70s and early 80s, and it might be that some of our viewers immediately go, to Ronald Reagan, but it's worth pointing out that the regulations you're talking about probably happened under the Carter administration, who's a Democrat.
Right. They were all airline deregulation, 1978, trucking deregulation, and rail deregulation in 1980, all when Jimmy Carter was president. And you had a rare bipartisan consensus that these regulations needed to be dialed back. And I think that, the 70s were just the time of malaise. And I think everyone agreed that came to the realization that these accumulated regulations over the time are really harming consumers. There was a strong, this was also coincided with the law and economics revolution and reorienting competition policy around the consumer welfare standards. So focusing on how industrial organization benefits consumers, that I don't think was a coincidence. And I think because before that, special interests had gotten their claws into basically every aspect of the economy. So this consensus formed. It didn't happen under President Carter. It was more he happened to be in the right place at the right time and was willing to help push this. I mean, and that's having you can have an academic consensus which had formed, and you'd had work done in prior administrations and prior Congresses, but having someone like President Carter there who would appoint the right people to key positions was absolutely very important. So even you can't attribute all of this to President Carter and even the people who were involved then, but really taking advantage of that moment. Um, it probably wouldn't have been as effective if, certainly you didn't have a full buy-in from the very top, which is I think what we had at the time, at least on the transportation in the transportation sector.
Yeah, I just sometimes people can write off a discussion because they place it in a context where, well, that's not where it belongs. Now, they might have different criticisms of it or different thoughts about it, but I wanted to put it in at least in the right context that if one's going to investigate this sort of thing, start from there. This was bipartisan, as you said, and
Right.
under
And
a
with
Democratic
look,
president.
airlines, it was Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy was the major congressional champion. Ralph Nader was a strong proponent of this. It was truly a strange bedfellows coalition at the time. And I think it really is worth underscoring just how bad the situation was then, that it kind of forced people to think a bit more creatively than they had been.
No, I thank you. I thank you for that. And so I want to come to uh, the last couple questions, but one of the things that I want to ask is, so I read an article recently, working age young adults in China, uh, really kind of being unhappy because they're going to school to train for high tech jobs, but when they come out, all their, the majority of the jobs are not ones that they needed to do all this for. They're more manufacturing jobs, which are great jobs, but they didn't need this training in technology and whatever else that they got. And you have students in the United States who are trying to do similarly, train for that next job, train in the new technology. We talked about AI or whatever it may be, or logistics technology, which I just find amazing. Um, these regulations that we're talking about, whether they're regulations on the gig economy or the railroad or whatever, what what kind of what kind of slowdown are they causing? What kind of, we're out to protect current jobs, right? When we do regulations, we often see that we want to protect the current workers. But in the process of doing that, what jobs are we inhibiting or preventing, or new wave of productive activity that people don't even see and think about? Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, I think the regulation, as you said, I mean, it's often designed to freeze that moment in place in perpetuity, and that just ignores the dynamic nature of markets and of
Oh, you're freezing up there.
individuals who make up the economy. Yeah, all sorts of right. I mean, so, but what I think people ignore, I mean, we saw this where you had, even, I mean, the most obvious examples are the explicit, we require this number of jobs to do this task. That will just make those firms who are subject to those rules, they're not going to invest in productivity enhancements. And if they're not investing in productivity enhancements, and they're not trying to provide better service, better product at a lower cost, they're fundamentally not going to be able to compete over time. And in a global economy, I think that's especially important. So you saw, I mean, in the going back to the old example, the railroads, it used to take about 6 people to operate a train. Now we're down to typically 2 or 3, and these are often a mile and a half long. The technology is there to bring that down to one, and obviously the labor unions have been opposing that and have been trying to right now very successfully convince regulators to mandate those minimum number of employees. And I think that is, where in the transportation sector, the problem there is we're seeing automation across all modes of transportation. So if you are seeing automation occur in trucking, which is happening, and it's gonna take time for all of this to unfold. But rail's cost advantage is threatened long term with an automated trucking workforce. And if you're preventing rail from automating as well, you're not going to have those competitive dynamics that are trying to drive down the cost of transportation. And I think that is fundamentally where we lose. We lose in that foregone productivity, and we're just seeing investment in places where or investment not occurring, or occurring in places where it shouldn't be occurring or wouldn't otherwise be occurring. So I think we risk long-term competitiveness for and social welfare for that kind of short-termist, we must protect the jobs of today forever kind of thinking.
And here's the thing that you might be able to help us with, and it's going to go a little bit more into this. When people hear words like markets or productivity or competitiveness or automation, they kind of stop at that abstraction, and it becomes sort of this passive term. Automation happens. And that's not the way it goes, because for every piece of automation, whether it's software or hardware, there's another firm somewhere making those products, correct?
Absolutely. So you're going to see, I mean, a workforce to that either leverages or services, maintains these systems that doesn't exist today. That will obviously happen. I mean, think of the immense gains of the economy from Microsoft Excel. Sure, there were bookkeeper jobs lost along the way, but we now spreadsheets are embedded into everything, and we have that better data lets firms compete in a way that they couldn't have done in the past. So I think that the drive towards long-term productivity, towards efficiency, it shouldn't be rejected out of these short-termist concerns about very particular jobs, because as you said, that ignores the future jobs that will be created in this more productive economy. And they tend to also be, when we leverage these productivity enhancing technologies like automation, the jobs that follow, that work where the labor is still mixed with that capital of automation, those tend to be much better paying jobs than the ones they replace. I mean, if we wanted to maximize employment on building roads, we could give everyone shovels, and that was how people used to do it. But the people who are driving heavy equipment today, they are much better compensated than people who dug ditches in the past. So I think it's important to keep in mind that yes, this is going to require new skills, a new type of workforce, but it doesn't end with the replacement of some workers with a form of technology.
Right. And when we speak of it, sometimes we're talking about future growth. And of course, in the future, there'll be jobs that exist that we don't even know about now. But a lot of the jobs that
Right.
we're talking about in terms with automation, I mean, there are entrepreneurial firms doing that. There are firms building the automation, doing the software, like I said, with logistics. And I can't remember specific companies, but getting product from point A to point B or Z requires a lot of coordination, and a lot of that used to be done by hand and paper, and there are now companies that are producing software and other solutions to in effect coordinate all this. And those kind of jobs are here now, and would possibly be more of, which would utilize these skills that people are learning today. And yeah, if we freeze the current moment, then yeah, we're stagnating. Um, so that was kind of, but yeah, no, I thank you on that. Your screen froze a little bit there. Are you back now? Can you hear me?
Am I back? Can you hear? I can hear you. I never lost you.
Okay, yeah, no, your screen's freezing up a little bit. I didn't know if I had lost you. Um, but and like I said, I send this out for editing, so they'll they'll wipe that.
We haven't
Um,
gotten the internet, which is a great substitution for transportation, not a perfect substitute yet.
Not yet. But still something better than the wildest dreams. I remember the pictures of video phones and stuff like in comic books, and it's like,
Right.
and I laugh, as a side, I laugh, watch Star Wars or whatever, to shut down the system, you had to walk across this plank and go around this pillar and you boo. Now it'd be just somebody in front of a Microsoft suite, like click. If you really wanted to shut down the Death Star, you'd have to go into the computer. There's not like some secret fuse box way in the back that you're going to unscrew. It's amazing what you can do just from here.
Right. And looking at sort of old Hollywood movies, kind of, their take on the future. It's amazing how our future didn't turn out to involve more ticker tape and dot matrix printers. That's always
Yeah, no, I had a dot matrix printer, and thankfully they're a thing of the past. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I want, but now this one's going to be a personal one, in a sense. Um, Probably safe to say, people with a sort of libertarian outlook, usually in the minority, you're in college, or coming out and looking for a job. Did you find any points in that journey where you felt, um, I don't know if I want to say disadvantaged, or you felt that people were kind of putting pressure on you, or you thought maybe you had to, like, maybe I got to keep my mouth quiet in this class? Did you ever feel the to either cleanse your CV? Have you ever felt sort of a hostility towards these ideas that have led you to hold back in some way?
um I think not so much. I mean, I perhaps a little bit. I mean, recognizing that there are certain situations where um, it's not worth uh, engaging, whether that's in a professional or personal context. Um, but generally, I like to, I think you can still have polite discussions with most people. I mean, I think there's always going to be, um, kind of closed-minded people. I do think, even though I think in recent years there's been some, kind of dialing up in rhetoric, um, and then certain I think troubling things happening in I mean, from afar, seen in the sort of higher education setting, but also in I see a bit of that in professional settings, not within the libertarian world, but in the folks I interact with outside of it. But I think by and large, having open and honest discussions is still possible. And I think there may have been, I think, 2020 with the pandemic, and I think there was a brief period of national insanity that, at least in my view, and I'm in Washington D.C., which is very much skewed a certain sort of ideological predisposition. And I think there is, even here in Washington, it is, you are able to have discussions. Not that they'll be productive and you're going to immediately change everyone's minds, but you can still, I think, have a lot of these discussions. So I'm not too discouraged. I know I speak with some people who are much more discouraged than I am, and maybe they're right. But me personally, I am not entirely discouraged by the intellectual climate.
Whoa. All right. No, that's good news. I'm glad to hear
Some
that
optimism.
there's still um I work at university and we won't go into that. So I'm glad to hear such news about reasoned discussion on the outside. That is heartening, especially when it comes to policy. And you're in Washington, D.C. So if any place we would like reasoned discussion on all sides to take place there. And I'm glad to hear that there's uh, that it still exists and that there's a ray of hope or multiple rays of hope. Marc, is there anything final you'd like to leave our viewers with? Is like uh, some book that they should be reading or something they should be focused on and watching um, as they move forward, learning more about transportation issues?
Well, I've got to encourage everyone to read Reason Magazine, which is a wonderful publication. And I've been reading it since I was, 14, 15 years old, or however old I was, a freshman in high school. Um, but if you're interested more in free market transportation policy, I strongly encourage you to check out Reason's work on that. As I said, Bob Poole, who's the founder of Reason, is still, leading the way on these kinds of issues. And the reason.org has a great repository of information there. But Bob also has a book that was published a few years ago by University of Chicago Press called Rethinking America's Highways. That is fascinating and comprehensive look at how you might apply markets to these very traditional government monopolies.
Well, thank you. All those links are posted below here. You can check those out and to the Reason Foundation and the other sources that Marc has described, as well as the Academy on Capitalism. I also encourage all of those who've tuned in today to please watch our other videos on the importance of free markets and the values they add. And I hope all of you out there are thinking the same thing I am, and that is thank you, Marc, for your time. Thank you for answering these questions, and it has been a true pleasure being able to talk to you about them.
Well, thank you, Bill. It was my pleasure.